In August 2020, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council approved Draft Addendum 33 in the Council's Commercial State Allocation Amendment for public comment. These actions considered changes to the state shares of the coastwide black sea bass commercial quota, as well as several options for changes to federal management of commercial black sea bass. In this presentation, we'll cover background information on the action, each of the proposed management options related to the commercial state allocations, and the proposed options for federal management of commercial black sea bass, as well as how to submit public comments on the action. This table provides the timeline for this action's development. In October 2019, the board initiated Addendum 33 to consider adjusting the state shares of the commercial coastwide black sea bass quota. In December 2019, the Council initiated an amendment considering the same options as the addendum, as well as some options for federal management of commercial black sea bass. And in August 2020, the Board and Council approved Draft Addendum 33 and the Council's draft amendment for public comment. The public comment period for these actions is ongoing now, with public hearings occurring throughout October. Summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass are managed jointly by the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. The Council oversees management of these species in federal waters, and the Commission is responsible for management of state waters. Because of some differences in how these bodies manage black sea bass, the Commission is considering a draft addendum and the Council is considering an amendment. However, these two actions consider the same management options for black sea bass commercial allocations and federal management. Depending on the option selected, one or both bodies will modify their fishery management plans. The draft addendum and council amendment address the issue that state quota allocations for commercial black sea bass were originally implemented in 2003, and there have been significant changes to stock abundance and distribution in the last decade as the stock has grown and expanded more to the north of Hudson Canyon, and as a result, the current allocations are not as aligned with the current distribution and availability of the resource. Addendum 33 and the Council Amendment have two goals as defined by the Board and Council. One is to consider adjusting the current commercial black sea bass allocations using current distribution and abundance of black sea bass as one of several adjustment factors to achieve more balanced access to the resource. These adjustment factors will be identified as the development process moves forward. The other goal is to consider whether the state allocations should continue to be managed only under the Commission's FMP or whether they should be managed under both the Commission and Council FMPs. The action considers a number of proposed management options for adjusting the state allocations of commercial black sea bass quota. And Appendix 1 of Draft Addendum 33 for public comment contains a full flowchart of the proposed management options, including the various sub-options for each approach. The first option for consideration is option A, status quo. The table on the right shows the current state allocations, which were established in 2003 through Amendment 13 to the Black Sea Bass FMP. These percentages were based loosely on historical landings by state from 1980 to 2001. Amendment 13 also established a structure in which the state shares are only managed under the Commission FMP, while the Council manages the coastwide quota for black sea bass. Option B proposes to increase Connecticut's state quota from 1% to 5%. This is intended to address the disparity between their current quota and the increases in black sea bass availability that have occurred in recent years in Connecticut state waters. The method proposed to get to 5% is to hold Delaware and New York constant because they have also relatively low quotas, to move 0.25% each from Maine and New Hampshire to Connecticut, and finally to move some quota from the remaining states to Connecticut in proportion to their current allocations to get to the total of 5%. This option is intended to either stand alone or be combined with the other options so that the new allocations shown in the table would serve as the starting point for any additional allocation changes. Next is option C, which is the DARA approach. This stands for Dynamic Adjustments to Regional Allocations, and this is a formulaic approach aiming to balance fishery stability and a changing stock distribution, and it has two phases. Phase 1 is a transition period of several years in which the initial allocations, which are not currently influenced by stock distribution, are gradually adjusted through a formula to give the current stock distribution more weight in determining the state allocations. At the end of the transition period, the allocations would be based partially on stock distribution information and partially on the initial allocations. In phase 2, the state allocations are no longer adjusted to give more weight to the stock distribution information, and instead they're only updated when new information on regional stock distribution becomes available, such as when there's a new stock assessment. So after the transition, there's a dynamic component that does change with stock distribution. This approach is designed to be very flexible with each of the sub-options, determining the speed of the transition as well as the overall change in allocations during the 2 phases. Each set of sub-options is also designed to represent the minimum and maximum of a range, which means the final management option selected by the Board and Council could fall within the sub-options values proposed. This slide will demonstrate how the formula in the DARA approach functions to produce the overall state allocations of the coast-wide quota. And the formula starts with the coast-wide quota. That quota gets divided into the portion based on the initial allocations and the portion based on stock distribution. The first portion is divided among all the states based on their initial allocations, and the second portion is divided regionally based on the proportions of stock biomass in each region. Then those regional portions get allocated to the states in each region in proportion to their initial allocations. And then finally, each state gets its overall allocation from the part of the quota based on the initial allocations, plus the part of the quota that's allocated regionally. The sub-options under the DARA approach will determine what the percentages are in the first step during each year of the transition and afterward. DARA sub-options set C1 is shown here. The option selected would determine what the relative importance of initial allocations versus resource distribution are in determining the state allocations at the end of the transition phase. And C1A proposes allocations that would be based 90% on stock distribution and 10% on the initial allocations. This means the allocations at the end of the transition phase would be more dependent on the stock distribution information than on the initial allocations. C1B proposes allocations based 50% on stock distribution and 50% on initial allocations, and this would result in stock distribution and initial allocations having an equal influence on the resulting state allocations. The figure here shows the difference in weight distribution between these 2 factors under each option, and as a reminder, the final management option selected by the Board and Council could fall within these proposed values. DARA sub-option set C2 would determine how much the relative weights of those 2 factors change with each adjustment during the transition phase. Sub-option C2A would change the relative weights by 5% per adjustment, and sub-option C2B would change the relative weights by 20% per adjustment. So for example, you can imagine starting from the status quo allocations, which are based 100% on initial allocations and 0% on resource distribution. And the goal is to get to a final distribution of 40%, 60%. So you can see with those adjustments of 5%, it would take much more time to get to the final distribution than with adjustments of 20%. And that's shown in the figure with option C2A shown as the blue line and C2B shown as the orange line. DARA sub-option set C3 determines how often during the transition period adjustments are made to the weights of the initial allocation and stock distribution factors. The 2 options are to make adjustments every year or to make adjustments every other year until the final weights are reached. And as you can see in the example figure, with adjustments every year, the transition to the final weights occurs faster than with adjustments made every other year. Sub-option set C4 provides the option for a cap to be set to limit the amount of change in the regional allocations per adjustment during the transition period. The purpose of a cap would be to provide additional stability in the allocations during the transition period. And there's 3 options, which are a 3% cap, a 10% cap, or no cap. A smaller cap would likely result in a longer transition period and smaller changes to the regional and state allocations during each adjustment. The next proposed option is D, the trigger approach. This approach sets a minimum level of coast-wide quota as a trigger for change in the state allocations. So if the annual coast-wide quota is higher than the established quota trigger, then the amount of coast-wide quota up to and including that trigger would be distributed to the states according to base allocations. And the amount of quota above that established trigger, the surplus quota, would be distributed using a different allocation scheme. The trigger amount and the allocation scheme for the surplus quota are determined by the following sub-options. The first set of sub-options determine the trigger amount. The options are either a 3 million pound trigger or a 4.5 million pound trigger. The figure below shows how these two options compare to the coast-wide quotas since 1998. And as with the DARA sub-options, these options are meant to represent a range with the understanding that the board and council could select a final value within this range. Sub-option set D2 determines how the surplus quota above the trigger value is distributed to the states. Option D2A is to distribute surplus quota evenly to the states of Massachusetts through North Carolina, and option D2B is to distribute surplus quota among regions based on regional biomass proportions from the stock assessment. And given their historically low participation in the Black sea bass fishery, Maine and New Hampshire would receive only 1% each of the surplus quota under each of these options. If option D2B is chosen from the last set, this set of sub-options then determines how the regional surplus quotas would be divided among states in each region. So option D3A is that the regional quota gets divided evenly among the states in a region, and option D3B is that the regional quota gets divided among the states in a region in proportion to their initial allocations. The last set of sub-options for the trigger approach relates to whether the base allocations used to allocate the quota up to and including the trigger would change over time. These sub-options only apply under option D2B for the regional surplus allocation. Sub-option D4A is for static base allocations, which means that every year the quota up to and including the trigger would be allocated using the same initial allocations. And sub-option D4B is that there would be dynamic base allocations, meaning each year the quota up to and including the trigger amount would be allocated according to the previous year's final state allocations resulting from the trigger approach. So they would change over time. The next option, option E, is a trigger approach that would apply the surplus quota to increase the Connecticut and New York allocations first. It proposes a 3 million pound trigger level. The first 3 million pounds would be distributed based on the initial allocations, and the surplus would be distributed first to Connecticut to increase their allocation from 1% to 5%. Remaining surplus would go to New York to increase their allocation from 7% to 9% of the coastwide quota. And lastly, any remaining surplus quota would be split between the northern and southern regions based on the proportion of biomass in each region, and then allocated to the states within those regions in proportion to their initial allocations. And there's no additional sub-options for this option. The last approach for adjusting the state allocations is option F, in which a fixed percentage of the annual coastwide quota is distributed based on initial allocations, and the other percent is distributed differently. This is different from the trigger approach in that the amount of overall quota does not affect the percentage of quota that's allocated using the base allocations. So it allows for some of the quota to be allocated using a different distribution, even under lower coastwide quotas. Sub-option set F1 would determine what percent of the coastwide quota would be allocated based on the initial allocations, regardless of the coastwide quota. And the 25% option would result in allocations that are more different from the current allocations, while the 75% option would result in allocations that are more similar to the current allocations. And similar to the DARA approach and the trigger approach, these sub-options are also designed to represent a range, and the board and council could choose a value within these proposed values. This and the following sub-options are very similar to those under the trigger approach. This set determines how to distribute the remaining percentage of annual coastwide quota that's not allocated based on the initial allocations. Sub-option F2A is to distribute that remaining quota to all states equally except for Maine and New Hampshire, and sub-option F2B is to distribute the remaining quota based on regional biomass from the stock assessment. And if option F2B is chosen, option set F3 would determine how the regional quota would get distributed to the states within a region. The sub-options are F3A, regional quota is distributed evenly to the states within each region, or F3B, regional quota is distributed in proportion to the initial intra-regional allocations. This option set is for determining a regional configuration, and this relates only to the allocation approaches that incorporate regional distribution information from the stock assessment. Option G1 would divide the states into two regions, Maine through New York and New Jersey through North Carolina, and these regions generally align with the spatial subunits used in the Black Sea Bass Stock Assessment, which are separated approximately by Hudson Canyon. And in this option, New Jersey is included in the southern region. Option G2 would establish three regions, which are Maine through New York, New Jersey on its own, and Delaware through North Carolina. This option attempts to address New Jersey's unique position straddling Hudson Canyon, and that on average, about half of New Jersey's commercial landings come from north of Hudson Canyon and about half from south of Hudson Canyon. So that concludes the proposed options related to the state allocations of the commercial Black Sea Bass quota, and next are the options for Black Sea Bass management under the Council's FMP. The first issue for federal management options is whether or not to add the commercial state allocations to the Council's FMP. Option A is status quo, meaning the allocations would remain only in the Commission's FMP, and this means that each state gets equal voting power in determining changes to the allocations. Option B is that the state allocations would be added to the Council's FMP and therefore included in both of the Commission and Council FMPs. Under option B, future allocation changes would be considered through joint action of both bodies. State landings would be monitored by NOAA Fisheries, and interstate transfers would also be managed by NOAA Fisheries. These sub-options would only apply if state allocations are added to the Council FMP, and they would determine when paybacks of the state quota overages would be required. Sub-option B1 would require paybacks of state overages only if the coastwide quota is exceeded. This is the current process that's used by the Commission. And then sub-option B2 would always require states to pay back overages if their quota is exceeded. The exact amount of pounds by which a state's quota is exceeded would be deducted from that state's allocation in the following year. The next set of options consider when federal in-season closures would occur. These options will be considered whether the allocations are added to the Council FMP or not. Option A is status quo, which is that a coastwide federal in-season closure would occur when landings are projected to exceed the coastwide quota. Option B is that a coastwide closure would occur when landings are projected to exceed the coastwide quota plus a buffer of up to 5% of the coastwide quota. And the purpose of this option is to provide more flexibility for states that have not fully harvested their quotas if another state's landings result in a coastwide overage. Option C is that a coastwide closure would occur when the commercial ACL is projected to be exceeded. And because discards in weight cannot currently be monitored in season, this option would require the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office to make assumptions about discards in the current year in order to project when the ACL has been exceeded. The next slides provide information on how to provide public comment on this action. Public input is highly valuable to the Commission and Council in their decision-making process, and to be most effective, comments should address the following questions. Which of the proposed options do you support and which do you oppose? For the overall options that you support, which sub-options do you support and which do you oppose? Why do you support or oppose those options? And lastly, is there any additional information that should be considered? The Commission and Council have scheduled 7 public hearings to gather public input on the draft addendum and Council amendment, and members of the commercial fishing industry and other stakeholders are encouraged to provide input by participating in a public hearing, which will all occur virtually due to COVID-19. This table provides the dates and times of the 7 scheduled webinars. For more information on attending one of the public hearings, please visit www.asmfc.org/calendar, or you can contact Caitlin Starks, FMP coordinator at cstarks@asmfc.org. You can also submit written comments on draft addendum 33 and the Council amendment by email, mail, or fax using the contact information shown here.